So I mentioned in a previous video that Paradise Lost was sort of my white whale. I've tried to read it several times since undergrad, and I've always struggled with understanding what was going on in terms of the verse. And this is something I struggled with a lot of poetry for a long time, and in fact I thought basically the only poets I really liked were Emily Dickinson, Robert Frost, and Rudyard Kipling, both of whom I have elsewhere, and then a few random poems from other people. And I had tried to find other poems from other people I would like, and generally it felt like I was not able to follow what was going on, at least for most of the poems. So then after my father died, I was like, I should be trying to read more. And then also, I read the book The Third Door, where he interviewed Maya Angelou, and her book of poetry was in purple, which is my favorite color, if you can't tell, and I took as a sign, and I read it, and I'm like, oh, I can read, I can follow Maya Angelou very easily. But then I started trying to read other poetry, and I found that I was often still having a hard time following it. And I realized, so I have a friend who has aphantasia. She can't visualize, but like me, she's hyperlexic. She taught herself to read before the age of 3. And I asked her, well, if you're not visualizing the book, like, how are you reading? And she's like, well, I'm processing it and I'm getting the emotions. And I tried reading poetry that way, and I realized that actually works for a lot of poetry for me. But I think also, I realized recently I might have synesthesia, which might be part of the problem, is that the verse is often creating images in my mind that are interfering with understanding what's going on. Like, I'm getting pictures, and that was sort of an issue I had, I think, in Pilgrim's Progress too, which I put back away, where I was visualizing like scenes, but it was hard for me to follow, and I had to go back and reread to actually get it. And that was not verse, but it was a specific sort of interference, I think. And it's interesting. So I mentioned before my love of Borges. So I read Borges poetry, but I also read Borges talking about poetry, and he describes there's two kinds of poetry. Poetry that is trying to convey an image, and poetry that is trying to convey an emotion. And I think when the images are clear in terms of the narrative, it's easy for me. And when they're not, that's when I struggle. So like Rumi, like Coleridge, that's the kind of poetry that I struggle with. And Borges, generally, I don't struggle with his poetry. So I added Borges, and I added Maya Angelou as both poets that they write in a style that is easy for me to read. But a lot of other poets that I've tried reading, I still have this issue where I struggle to follow it if I'm just visualizing it. But if I read it and feel, then I can sort of get it, but I still don't appreciate it the same way as when I'm visualizing it. So like Coleridge, like Rumi, I sort of have that going on. But I do read a lot more poetry than I read in my adult life, basically, as a result of first realizing, oh yeah, my father read a lot of poetry, and I should too. And then also, again, the whole thing with Third Door, and then Maya Angelou and Borges, two of them sort of opened the door for me in terms of appreciating a wider range of poetry than just basically 19th century writers who lived in New England and were very possibly neurodivergent. Like, you look at the story of Dickinson, Kipling, and Frost, and it wouldn't surprise me for any of them. Wouldn't surprise me, honestly, if Borges and Maya Angelou were neurodivergent as well. Anyways, I just wanted to talk about that quickly, because I think a lot of people struggle to read poetry, and part of it is modern poetry is often not good, which is something C.S. Lewis talked about. But also, I don't know if my specific problem of a lot of poetry is meant to be felt, but I was visualizing disconnected scenes as opposed to the narrative. It was frustrating and confusing for me. And it's weird, because I can read a lot of stuff that people find notoriously difficult to read, but verse has always been difficult to me, such that I attempted Paradise Lost at least 2 or 3 times before I finally actually managed to read it. But anyways, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. I'm Magpie, and I'll see y'all in the next one.